What if I told you that almost all commercial fiction owes its success to a single element of the craft of writing? And, furthermore, what if I told you that by mastering that element of the craft, you would never have to worry again about losing your reader's interest? And what if I told you that by watching a single YouTube video, you could take a big step toward mastering that element of the craft? Well, you've read the title of the video, so you kind of already know what I'm talking about, and yet you're still waiting for me to come out and say it out loud. Why is that? I think it's because I've been building tension. So, if you've been studying writing for any amount of time, you're probably familiar with the word, but maybe you've never really heard it defined in a clear way. So I'm going to start out by giving you my definition for tension. Basically, tension is about making the reader uncomfortable. Any story has changes that occur within it. That's what makes them interesting and exciting. And when we see a change coming and we know that it's going to be significant to us, then we feel an anticipation toward that change. Until it happens, we're going to have this unresolved emotion. We won't be able to sit still. We'll want to keep reading. And so that's the nature of tension. It's an unresolved emotion that drives us to keep reading in the expectation of reaching some kind of significant change in the story. So we can think of it as having two components. First, you have the payoff, which is whatever that emotionally significant change is. Second, you have the driving emotion. That's the unresolved feeling which makes us want to keep reading. These two things are connected. The emotional charge of the payoff, whatever that might be, is going to dictate the emotional charge of that driving feeling. And as you move toward the payoff, the intensity of that driving emotion is going to increase. So, if you have a payoff with a positive emotional charge, like maybe you're reading some romance and you're waiting for the romantic leads to get together, to finally smooch, that's a positive emotional charge. It's warmth, it's desire, it's love. And so the driving emotion will be flavored similarly. It will be anticipation, excitement. Those emotions, although they are positive, are still unsatisfied. They're going to be driving you on until you get the final payoff. If the payoff has a negative emotional charge, maybe you're reading horror, you're expecting something bad to happen to a protagonist, the driving emotion is also going to have feelings of disgust or fear or anxiety, feelings that would push you away from that payoff. And yet, until they're resolved, you'll feel compelled to keep reading. So, that definition of tension makes sense when we're talking about the reader's experience. But the concept of tension is actually really versatile. It can be put to a bunch of different uses in storytelling. For example, when the reader is experiencing tension, chances are good that one of the characters is going to be experiencing the same tension. The characters exist in the story. They have things that they anticipate, that they feel strongly about. The difference is that unlike the reader, the characters can take actions within the story. They can influence the payoff. So tension becomes a useful way of thinking about character motivation. We can use the same two components that I talked about earlier. The driving emotion is the motivator. That unresolved feeling makes the character want to act. Until it's resolved, they'll keep acting to influence the payoff, to change it to what they want it to be. The nature of the payoff itself tells us exactly what kinds of actions that character is going to want to take, what they'll have to do to change it. That can look a couple of different ways, depending on the emotional charge of the payoff. For example, sometimes you have a payoff with a positive emotional charge. Imagine you have a character who's an adventurer, they're seeking some buried treasure somewhere. That is a pull tension, because the payoff and the driving emotion pulls the characters toward that payoff. Sometimes, though, the payoff will have a negative emotional charge. Imagine a horror movie. There's a monster sneaking up behind the protagonist or following them. The protagonist doesn't want the payoff to happen because the payoff is something bad happening to them. But we want to avoid that, which means that the character is going to take actions to move away from the payoff instead, thus a push tension. Now, depending on which kind of tension your character is undergoing, they're going to resolve in different ways. Remember that when we move toward the payoff, the intensity of the driving emotion is going to increase. So if we graph the intensity of that emotion over time, you'll see that in a pull tension, as the character takes actions to move toward the payoff, the intensity is going to increase until they hit that payoff, get the catharsis, and then it plummets down again. The tension is resolved. But with a push tension, the character's moving away from the payoff. What that means is that slowly the intensity of their driving emotion will decrease and decrease and decrease until there's nothing left. The situation changes enough that we no longer anticipate that payoff, and again, the tension is resolved, but in a different way. So, why don't we try all this stuff out in a little example? For this example, I've cooked up a character named Dr. Wilkins. He is one of those cyberpunk-type doctors who specializes in putting machines into people's bodies. To start out, let's give him a strong pull tension. He gets abducted by some shady people working for a corporation, and he is taken to a secret laboratory. There, he's introduced to his patient, a 10-year-old boy in a coma. It's a side effect of some of the experimental cybernetics that were implanted in him without proper testing. Dr. Wilkins has been brought there to remove those cybernetics and to save the kid's life. Now, Dr. Wilkins got into this line of work for the money, and most of his business consists of putting hidden blades and other weapons into people's arms. Over the years, he's started to feel guilty about this, leading to a life of depression and self-medication fueled by self-hatred. This job gives him an opportunity to do some good for a change, so he's resolved to succeed and save the kid's life in order to prove to himself that he is not a complete waste of oxygen. Here we have a pull tension with the payoff of saving a young patient's life, using a driving emotion of hope. Wilkins hopes that he can redeem himself in his own eyes. Now, while we're here, we can also add a push tension that layers right on top of that. Remember, Wilkins was taken against his will and forced to do this job by some shady corporate people. If he doesn't save the kid's life, they've told him that they'll take his as compensation. That gives us a push tension, the payoff of which is failure and 2 deaths, his and the kid's. The driving emotion is dread. As Wilkins does his best to excise the malignant cybernetics and save the kid's life, he'll be moving away from the second payoff and toward the first. Let's graph his progress. Remember that as we move toward the payoff of a tension, its driving emotion will become more intense. In the case of the pull tension, the doctor's actions will move us closer to it over time, which means that the intensity will increase steadily until he finally succeeds in saving the kid and the situation is resolved. For the push tension, the doctor's actions will move us away from the payoff, and the intensity will slowly decrease until we no longer anticipate the payoff at all. So, Wilkins definitely has some strong motivations now. But how does this look from the reader's perspective? Unfortunately, these straight-line graphs are a bad sign. If Wilkins' progress is steady and uninterrupted, then the story will be predictable. You could read a single chapter of it and know exactly how the rest would go. We need some way to spice this up. So, how do we spice up this flatline graph? We use conflict. Conflict in this context means that we're going to have 2 forces acting on the story instead of just 1. Previously, we only talked about the character's primary motivation, which makes them want to take actions that will move them either toward or away from the payoff. Now, if we want to create conflict, we need to move the story in the opposite direction that the character wants it to move. So you need some kind of opposing force that enters the story. If the character wants to move toward the payoff, it will push them away, and vice versa. If they want to move away, it will pull them back toward it. Now, over the course of the story, each of these 2 forces will be dominant at different times. That's how we create those fluctuations, by alternating which of the 2 forces has the greater influence on the story. Whether the character is currently succeeding against the opposing force, or whether they are being overwhelmed by it. Now, these conflicts can come in 2 different forms. You can have external conflict or internal conflict. External conflict is the simpler of the 2. It just means that this opposing force that we've introduced to the story is acting directly on the situation, on the material circumstances of your character. So the character will take an action motivated by their driving emotion, and then something else will happen to counteract whatever effect that had on the world. An internal conflict is a little bit different. It means that we have 2 distinct emotions within the character that are competing for control of their actions. So you can actually model that using tensions. We have 2 distinct tensions within the character, 2 different payoffs, which produce 2 different driving emotions, which will motivate the character to take contradictory actions. At one point, one of those emotions will be stronger, motivating the character to move, for example, toward the payoff, and then the other one will take dominance and move them in the opposite direction. That creates these peaks and valleys, this wave-like effect in the graph. Time to make poor Dr. Wilkins' life a little more difficult. I'll start with an external conflict, something that will challenge him in his attempts to remove the cybernetics from his patient. Already we can assume that a complex series of surgeries would be difficult and dangerous, but I want something beyond even that. How about we give the cybernetic enhancements themselves something of a mind of their own? They can resist being removed and might even attack Dr. Wilkins as he tries to remove them. Sometimes he will fail, and sometimes he'll succeed. Now, how about a little internal conflict? Wilkins has several good reasons to try to save the kid. Now we need to give him a reason that pushes against those. What kind of motivation could make him hesitate? Well, Wilkins' captors say they'll let him go if he succeeds, but he is not a trusting man. The cybernetics that he's been tasked with removing are cutting edge and probably a well-kept secret. He doesn't think that the company would really let him leave outside of a body bag. So he's trapped. If he refuses to do the surgeries, then he's not only risking his own life, but also his patient's. If he does the surgeries, he's moving closer to potentially being disappeared by the people who abducted him. I would frame this as a conflict between his desire to save the kid, the hope motivation, and an instinct for self-preservation, a fear motivation. You could also frame it as a conflict between two fear motivations, as Wilkins faces dire consequences for either outcome. It will work either way, but the motivations that I choose to emphasize will change how Wilkins comes across to the reader, and I'd like to keep the hope motivation central to his character. So, this shows us something about how conflict operates on a large scale, how to set it up within the story. But what does it actually look like within a given scene, or moment to moment? Well, again, tension can be a useful concept here. Let's look at this graph of the tension over time with conflict introduced. It has these peaks and valleys. What do you suppose those represent? Now, each peak and each valley represents a moment where one of the two forces in the conflict is becoming dominant over the other, where the dominance is alternating, switching from one to the other. Now, these moments can be emotionally significant. The protagonist, after being beaten back by an antagonist for chapters and chapters, finally discovers the clue or the key that they need to overcome the opposition, and they become the dominant force in the story once again. That's something that we can anticipate, that we can build tension toward. It becomes a payoff. And so, between any peak and any valley, we can draw a little tension arc, anticipating this shift between which force is dominant. If you look at the entire story like this, it becomes clear that it's basically just tensions all the way down. On the largest scale, we have the climax. We're anticipating that, we're building tension toward it, and it becomes a moment of catharsis that basically kicks off the end of the book. But below that, for every peak and valley in the intensity of feeling, every time we're switching whether we're moving toward or away from the payoff, we're looking at a smaller scale tension arc. In fact, any natural way to cut up a story, I think, derives from tension arcs. Each act, each scene and each chapter, each paragraph will probably have its own little anticipation, its own point, direction that it's moving in. This is really useful for a writer because it means that from the reader's perspective, there's always something on the small scale to anticipate. They're never without an expectation of a serious change coming up. That means you can just kind of string them along, even if there's nothing going on upstairs, even if there's no greater theme or story, moral, or message. Of course, as a serious writer, you might be interested in having some kind of a serious theme or message. And for one final instance, the concept of tension can help us out here too. Because attention, according to my definition, needs to have an emotionally significant payoff, and because we can look at the entire structure of the story as being composed of one large-scale tension leading up to the climax, we can say that any event in the story that moves us toward that climactic payoff or away from it is going to have some kind of emotional content. It inherits it from that large-scale tension, which can create an overarching structure of meaning, of significance, for any event within the story. So what does that look like specifically? It looks like making sure that the smaller scale tensions in your story are somehow related to the larger scale ones. I've thought of two different ways that they can be related. First, they could be aligned, which means that the motivation of the smaller scale tension pushes the character to take the same kinds of actions as the motivation in the larger scale tension. Alternatively, they could be opposed. This creates some internal conflict because it means that the smaller scale tension pushes the character to take the opposite kind of action as the larger scale tension above it. We have these two opposing motivations in this case that will persist as long as that smaller scale tension arc goes unresolved. Now, of course, it's still possible to use unrelated smaller scale tensions, and they can serve purposes in the story as well. Let's take another look at Dr. Wilkins' story graphs, now with the fluctuations caused by the conflict. The main tension in Dr. Wilkins' story has already been established. He wants to save his patient. Sometimes he'll take actions contradictory to that goal, but the audience will always want the kid to survive, and they'll want Wilkins to do the right thing and save him. Whenever something happens that helps the kid recover, it will feel like a positive change, and whenever something happens that puts him in danger, it will feel negative or at best mixed. In the previous example, I introduced another tension to give Wilkins some internal conflict. I made him afraid that, even if he succeeds, he won't be allowed to go home. That could make a good tension on the scale of an act. Wilkins will somehow learn that his suspicions were correct, and that the people who captured him don't intend on ever letting him leave. After that revelation, he'll put most of his effort toward finding a way to escape before that happens. This tension is opposed to the main tension. Escaping means that he'll have to leave his patient's treatment unfinished. Content warning for the next couple examples: a little light body horror. You can skip the next timestamp if that's not your cup of tea. Within that act of the story where Wilkins will be focused on escaping, I would need to come up with subtensions for each chapter and scene. Maybe, as the doctor has removed cybernetic components from the kid, he has secretly set some bits and pieces aside for further study. We can have a chapter that focuses on his process of retrofitting those salvaged parts into a hacking tool that he can use in his escape attempt. He'll need to build the new device, and in order to effectively conceal it, he'll have to implant it into his own body. He can fake a surgery on the kid, and instead use the time to do surgery on himself. Here's an idea for a scene tension within that chapter. Wilkins has just successfully implanted the makeshift hacking tool into his left arm. It was made out of the strange, semi-living cybernetics that he took out of the kid. He can feel it squirming around in there. Just then, he's summoned to meet the boss of the corporation that abducted him. She wants to check in on his progress in saving the kid. He has to sit through that meeting and give sane-sounding responses while the cybernetics he just finished installing integrate with his nervous system. If the boss notices anything strange, the jig is up for Wilkins. Ah, isn't that nice? We can draw a very clean connection from the tension happening in this scene all the way up to the main tension. At each step in the process, the audience should be able to get emotionally invested, because all of our tensions are aligned or opposed to each other. But what about the subtensions that are neither aligned nor opposed? Well, let's add one of those too, for good measure. There's a lot that we don't know about this story, because I made it up for these examples, and I didn't take the time to answer all of the pressing questions. Who put the cybernetics in this kid? Why did they do it? And what are the cybernetics for? Why does this company's boss care about saving him? It's only natural that the audience would be curious about those things. So we can turn that curiosity into a mystery. Wilkins will get curious too, and try to investigate the deeper levels of his situation throughout this story. That's a pull tension, driven by curiosity. It's not really aligned to the main tension, nor opposed to it. Learning more about the situation might make Wilkins better able to do his job, but sticking his nose into the company's secret also puts his position at risk. Even though it's not aligned to the other tensions, moving toward the payoff of this curiosity tension will still develop and deepen the story. Following his curiosity is probably how Wilkins learned that the company didn't plan on letting him live, which kicked off the act-scale tension of his plan to escape. In the end, it's still connected to the story as a whole, and that's what's important. Whew, that was a lot of talking. We have reached the end of the video now, without much ceremony, I'm afraid. So now it's time to do all the calls to action. Please, like, comment, subscribe, bell, and watch a previous video. I made one recently about world building, recently like a few months ago, so that's recent for me. It's a method to structure your world building according to causality, and if you enjoyed this video, you'll probably like that one too. Go check it out. That's all I have for you. Have a good day, and happy writing.